Can everybody see that?
Yep,
Awesome.
you're good.
Um, cool. Well, so again, I'm Sean Wineland. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability here at OU. I also work at the Oklahoma Biological Survey. And today I'm going to be talking about conservation planning and how we sort of face these difficult challenges of where to allocate resources and how to implement conservation initiatives. And I'm going to be mostly focusing on that through the lens of a case study that we did in the Red River Basin on implementing environmental flows. I'm going to start by talking about some depressing things and then maybe move towards some happier things in the end of this talk. So if we look at trends of biodiversity declines across systems, so thinking about terrestrial, marine, and freshwater systems, we see almost, so from 1970 to 2012, these are population abundance trends that were estimated from the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index. We're getting close to about 50% declines in terrestrial and marine ecosystems and 81% declines in freshwater ecosystems. So this rapid and drastic decline in biodiversity highlights the need to accelerate the implementation of conservation initiatives. And we can also think about this need to implement conservation initiatives by looking at the percentages of species that are listed as endangered, vulnerable, or that we need to study more carefully. So if we look at these differences again across terrestrial and marine ecosystems from a conservation perspective, we live in terrestrial ecosystems, so we tend to study them more, we tend to know more about them. So if we look at the number of data deficient species, meaning the species that we don't know enough about to make decisions or to allocate resources towards conserving, we see like 13% in terrestrial ecosystems versus almost a quarter in marine and freshwater systems. So thinking about these global patterns of biodiversity loss is important to me for contextualizing these local scale initiatives that we tend to focus on here in our region. And so I also like to highlight that conserving biodiversity is important in terms of patterns and processes. So patterns meaning the distribution, abundance, occupancy, richness, diversity, and rarity of species. And then processes in terms of important things like global processes like primary production, carbon cycling, all the way down to local things like habitat use and the ecosystem services provided by species. And we can also think about things like Jeremy Ross was talking about yesterday, phenology, the timing of seasonal events or local scale events that are important for biodiversity, and then things like vegetation dynamics and hydrologic dynamics as well. So I always like to point that out. So my first question for you is what are some patterns and processes of biodiversity that you manage or study? And you can just post those in the chat. Hopefully I can see the chat. Or maybe Emma could just read them off or something. Because I don't see how to view the chat.
Yes, I was struggling with this yesterday. I can read them off for you. So we've got one that says, our TNC preserves a ton of biological monitoring.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Seeing how the variation in patterns of biodiversity changes over time is super important. Development of new macroinvertebrate biocriteria, fish species conservation. Disease is another important process that we don't think about a lot. bird surveys, mammal surveys, botanical surveys. Yeah, all of those things are super relevant and important. So yeah, so decision makers or resource managers, hopefully that category relates to you. You might face the difficult challenge of deciding where to allocate increasingly scarce resources for both human and environmental needs under increasingly challenging and uncertain future sociopolitical and environmental climates. So I like to sort of phrase this as where and how to act in terms of conservation. So thinking about where are we going to allocate resources and how are we going to implement some sort of conservation initiative. And I'll sort of stick with that theme throughout this presentation. And so my second question to you is, given those patterns and processes that you may study, what are some difficult resource allocation problems or trade-offs between human and environmental uses of those resources that you currently face or study or anticipate to face or study in the future? So got one message from Chris Adams, changes in phyto and zooplankton assemblages in lakes. Yeah. Katie says, limited resources for unlimited needs. Yeah, definitely. Environmental flows is a high priority for us at the Nature Conservancy, definitely. Wastewater discharge and sensitive aquatic life. Overconsumption of species in the food cycle. Yeah. Yeah, so that's good that that we're thinking about what are the trade-offs now and what are the trade-offs going to be in the future. So when we think about resource management or conservation planning, there's a typical framework that we tend to follow in terms of conservation planning, and we can broadly break this up into two phases. So the research and assessment phase and the implementation phase. So in the research and assessment phase, we want to basically identify sites, come up with some goals and objectives, and then in the implementation phase, we're actually going to make that objective happen on the ground. But the problem is, in the field of conservation, we're facing this implementation crisis. So this paper by Knight et al. in 2008 actually researched a bunch of, they followed up with a bunch of different conservation planning initiatives, and they found that only 5.7 of those initiatives ever actually reached the implementation phase of conservation planning. And this paper is getting a little bit dated. Maybe that has changed now, but we're still seeing a significant research implementation gap in conservation, or the implementation of conservation initiatives that aim to protect biodiversity. And so why are we seeing this? One of the main problems is that we tend to fail to think about things from a socio-ecological systems perspective. And basically what that means is that we tend to focus on protecting biodiversity, and we fail to consider the trade-offs between the actions that we're recommending and how those actions will basically sit with the human aspect of that. So we fail to consider important socio-political factors when we implement or plan for conservation initiatives. So again, getting at this idea that there's complex trade-offs between conservation outcomes and human needs. And we also fail to consider climate adaptation and resilience in these frameworks as well. So again, focusing on this theme of the where to and the how to, when we prioritize for conservation actions, we tend to only focus on the where to. So we look at spatial patterns of biodiversity. We may implement some sort of species distribution model and look at where's the probability of occurrence for this species most high. And then we tend to focus on biodiversity value a lot. So the value that we put on species. We'll tend to focus on species that are critically endangered, or vulnerable a lot, but maybe not so much these species that are data deficient or least concern. That could also maybe use some help as well. And then prioritization frameworks, conservation planning, also fail to consider the how-to. So basically, I'm arguing here that we tend to consider conservation feasibility in conservation planning. So a broad definition that we could assign here is the sociopolitical factors that contribute to the likelihood of a conservation initiative being implemented and successful. So things like a stakeholders or landowners' willingness to participate in some sort of program or sell land or water rights to be allocated for conservation uses, looking at things like how social and ecological values align, examining sociopolitical resource and governance structures. So is it feasible to implement this given the laws and policies that we have right now? And also shared resource conflicts. So examining if we have sufficient resources to allocate for both humans and the environment. And so maybe considering conservation feasibility in these broader prioritization frameworks could lead to bridging that research implementation gap here. And I see a question from Monica. Is conservation feasibility similar to adaptive capacity? Yeah, I would say it's a little bit similar. What would be like a definition exactly for adaptive capacity? So something like you can go ahead and pop it in the chat there. I'm not super familiar with that term, is basically what I'm trying to say. How well a community is able to adapt. Yeah, and so I'll actually get to like adaptation and resilience later on. I think this is, so conservation feasibility is more geared towards like social and political factors. So like how people value the environment, how politics politics and political structures are able to, I guess, make it easier to implement conservation policy. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So also thinking about climate projections is important. So again, these prioritization frameworks fail to consider future climate projections. So a lot of these are actually called forecast-free approaches, where we're basically just closing our eyes and saying, we could put a protected area here or implement some sort of conservation initiative, but who knows if species ranges will shift in the future and this this protected area might not be useful anymore. So incorporating climate projections into conservation prioritizations is definitely a step towards accelerating and making the implementation of these frameworks more feasible. So what we did based on all of these factors that we've been thinking about is we developed a simple, flexible conservation prioritization framework that you can use by mapping the trade-offs between the where-to and the how-to. So biodiversity value being the where-to and conservation feasibility being the how-to across future climate scenarios. So we're basically integrating the failure of other frameworks to consider conservation feasibility and future climate change. So, and some of the strengths of this are that we are integrating social and ecological data. We're going to identify the key factors that contribute to conservation feasibility, and also identify site level variation in conservation priority. and we can also identify sites resilient to climate change. So basically how this works is we're going to map out the factors, the where to and the how to factors. And we can sort of delineate these rough quadrants across plotting out these factors and look at the trade-offs here. So for example, if a site were to fall within this high biodiversity value, high feasibility quadrant, we could sort of label that site as high priority or a low risk conservation investment because it's going to be highly valuable in terms of conserving species and highly feasible to implement. On the other hand, this quadrant over here, low biodiversity value, low feasibility, we can think of this as a low priority or high risk conservation investment. So we're not going to conserve a lot of species of high value, and it's going to be low feasibility. We're going to see a lot of sociopolitical resistance to implementing that conservation initiative there. These other two quadrants are a little bit different. So if I can get to it. This second quadrant up here, high biodiversity value, low feasibility. We can sort of label this or represent this quadrant or sites that fall within this quadrant as having significant trade-offs. So there are species there that we want to conserve, but we're going to face a lot of sociopolitical resistance to implementing some sort of initiative there. And this last quadrant down here, low biodiversity value, but high feasibility. We're able to implement some sort of initiative there, but it may not be super important to do so, and we might see some inefficient outcomes if we implement something there. So we may want to redirect our resources somewhere else if a site falls within that quadrant. And so where the climate change aspect comes into this is that we're going to map out these factors across different future climate scenarios. So for example, we can select a suite of general circulation models that basically describe how Earth's system and atmosphere works, and representative concentration pathways that Renee McPherson talked about yesterday. So these are basically scenarios that represent possible futures based on emissions and other things like that. So again, we're doing this to explore how these conservation outcomes vary across these future climate scenarios. So what are some of the factors that you can quantify to put into this framework? So in terms of biodiversity value, we can measure and quantify the distribution, occupancy, abundance of species, the ecosystem services provided by those species, maybe something like habitat use or suitability, and also risk of endangerment. So these are pretty easy to quantify. These are common ecological metrics, and we can pretty easily project these across future climate scenarios too. So if we're doing something like species distribution modeling, that already involves historical climate inputs, we can download or get some data, some future climate data, and project that into the future. On the conservation feasibility axis, this is a little bit more difficult to quantify because we're looking at social factors here. So for example, we can examine stakeholders or landowners' willingness to participate in some sort of conservation initiative. That might be a little bit difficult to project across future climate scenarios. So maybe we could just kind of hold that constant if we're interested in looking at that. Things that we can project across future climate scenarios would be things like funding or resource availability. And I'll talk a little bit about how we did that in our case study. So, so when we developed this framework, we wanted to see if it was effective at identifying site level variation and conservation priorities, and if it was effective at identifying sites resilient to climate change. And so we did this through applying the framework to seeing where it's most valuable and feasible to implement environmental flows in the Red River Basin. And I'll talk about the case study here now. So we selected 38 major reservoirs across the Red River Basin. And these were, I think, greater than 15,000 acre feet, and that had a significant societal and environmental impact. So these proportional symbols here are just showing the capacity of each reservoir. So you can see there's a little bit of variation across the Red River Basin. We tend to have some larger reservoirs over here where there's more water, obviously, and less reservoirs over here in the western part of the basin. And so we've been throwing around this term environmental flows. So I think it would be useful to talk about what are they. In a broad sense, a broad definition, you could define them as water for freshwater ecosystems and the human livelihoods that depend on them. So within a freshwater system, a river, for example, we tend to dam up water for societal uses so that we can store and treat the water for things like municipal and agricultural needs, like Jerry was talking about. But then we don't tend to release a lot of water from these reservoirs to sustain ecosystem needs, such as the life history characteristics of fish and mussels, and human and environmental flows also incorporate human livelihood and recreational needs. So things like subsistence fishing and recreational fishing and canoeing and stuff like that. And so what do? They mitigate adverse impacts from water diversion and storage. They mimic the natural flow regime, so the quantity, timing, and quality of river flows. And they're essential for riverine and floodplain ecosystem structure and function. So if we look at this figure here, this is just showing a river's discharge over time. The blue line is the natural hydrograph, or what the river would flow like without any dams or outtake of water for societal uses. And there's different metrics that we use to quantify environmental flows. So we could think of a minimum flow as the lowest amount of water in terms of the quantity and timing that we could use to mimic the natural flow regime of some of these peaks here. So this peak could represent like a really important flood that floods the banks for things like amphibians and insects, for them to complete their life cycles and stuff like that. And then there's also some more intense environmental flows, like functional floodplain flows that are going to be for sustaining vegetation and stuff like that. So again, there's different types and benefits of environmental flows. This is a cool figure from a group, I think they're based in Australia, that showed different types of environmental flows. So overbank flows are gonna improve soil and vegetation outcomes. High flows are gonna be beneficial for insects and stuff like that. And then sometimes rivers have low flows and cease to flow. That's part of the natural hydrologic cycle. And we need to understand that we can't always have environmental flows. So the challenge, though, of implementing environmental flows, specifically in the Red River Basin, these figures are from a study that was done last year by some folks in my lab, looking at the outcomes for societal and environmental water needs across the Red River Basin and across those 38 reservoirs that I was talking about. And so this figure here shows the average environmental satisfaction across all of these reservoirs. So how satisfied can we make environmental flows, and how satisfied are people for municipal and agricultural uses? And what this figure is basically showing is that with current water availability, this blue line, we're not able to meet both societal and environmental needs. So this is a Pareto trade-off curve showing that we're not able to meet both of those needs there. And what they quantified here is that to meet both societal and environmental needs, this black point here, we're going to need a 21% reduction in societal uses. So that's a lot of water if we think about that. And there's also significant spatial differences in the reservoirs that are going to be satisfied and unsatisfied. So thinking about that, it's very difficult to implement environmental flows across this river basin. And again, thinking here about implementing environmental flows, it's super important. So we're talking about modifying reservoir management practices to release more water to sustain downstream ecosystems to prevent things like this, which are major fish kills. But we also have to remember that we can't just, you know, again, thinking in a one-lane view about biodiversity, we have to be cognizant that we have to also sustain human needs of water too. We need to be able to provide food and water for people. So it's a significant challenge. And again, thinking about biodiversity. So in our case study, we mainly focused on fish because that's a main thing that people think about in river systems. And we can think about fish species as having different biodiversity value. So species like this down here, bass and green sunfish, they have recreational value, but they're pretty abundant and resilient species. So we can see that reflected in their conservation rankings. They're low priority, least concern. But maybe some of these other non-recreational species like the prairie chub and black spot shiner, these are tier 1 top priority species of conservation concern in Oklahoma, and actually listed as vulnerable in the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's rankings. And so what we did to sort of quantify biodiversity value in our case study was we developed an index of biodiversity value based on a suite of species distribution models across the Red River Basin. And we basically pared down these species distribution models to a 50-kilometer reach below each reservoir, because that's kind of the maximum, it was the minimum distance between the two closest reservoirs, and it kind of actually represents the maximum efficiency of releasing water from a reservoir that can make a significant impact downstream. And so we combined these species distribution models with measures of each of the species' biodiversity value from different criteria of endangerment. And we considered, I think, 32 total species. And we actually consulted some folks at the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation when we selected these species to see, we wanted to kind of represent a range of different conservation values and life histories. So we can see we've got some shiners, darters, minnows, catfish, sunfish, different bass species. We wanted to kind of represent the range of fish species that are present across the river basin in this study. And to quantify conservation feasibility, we basically looked at who would get most angry if we allocated more water to environmental flows. So basically, what would be the sociopolitical resistance of taking more water away from people to allocate it to environmental flows? So at each reservoir, we delineated this Pareto trade-off curve between the societal satisfaction and the environmental satisfaction of water across different climate scenarios. So for example, here at Lake Texoma, if we fully allocate water to environmental flows, we can fully meet the societal needs as well. We look at Atoka Reservoir, that's a little bit different. So when we fully allocate water for environmental flows, we're only satisfying about a quarter of the societal needs. So needless to say, people would get pretty angry if you said, hey, we're only going to satisfy about 25% of your uses. And at Kemp Reservoir, for example, we're not able to satisfy any of the societal uses. So I'm just looking at the chat here real quick. Chris Adams said, Sean, it looks like a number of these lakes are ungauged. This could be a good way to help us prioritize future lake gauging networks along with the other priorities we have to consider. Absolutely, yeah, and I'm happy to chat with anyone after the presentation or individually about how this data could help you out. So All right, so when we look at the results of quantifying biodiversity value in terms of fish species and conservation feasibility in terms of who would get angry if we allocated more water to environmental flows, and we look at how those vary across future climate scenarios, and we map these out, this is what we get. So I'm gonna kind of walk through this figure one climate scenario at a time here. So this general circulation model is CCSM4, and as you go down this row, you get increasing RCPs or increasing emission scenarios. So what we see here, and these, so each one of these dots represents a reservoir, and they're colored in terms of their longitude, so east to west. So what we see is that with increasing emission scenarios, some of these reservoirs that are drier in the western portion of the basin, they actually shift towards lower conservation feasibility and lower biodiversity value. But some of these eastern reservoirs actually remain high biodiversity value, high feasibility across that climate scenario. In the MIROC 5 model, so a similar pattern is seen. So we can see these sites shifting in the western part of the basin towards lower conservation feasibility. But a couple of those sites actually shift towards higher feasibility too. So there's different patterns that we're seeing. And in the last climate model, MPI ESM-LR, we don't see a whole lot of variation across these future climate scenarios, which is actually interesting. But another way to view this data, and I think this is kind of the highlight of this framework, is looking at where the outcomes consistent across future climate scenarios. So sort of getting at identifying those climate resilient sites. So what we're looking at here, this is a map of, again, all those 38 reservoirs. And this is a stacked bar chart showing how many times each of those sites fell within each one of these quadrants here. So again, thinking about where those outcomes are consistent, we can actually identify some pretty climate resilient sites using this conservation framework. So looking at some of these sites in eastern Oklahoma and down in Texas, they remain pretty consistently in this high conservation feasibility, high conservation feasibility, high biodiversity value quadrant up here, and similar down here. But again, there's trade-offs to everything. So in these arid western reaches of the basin, there's a lot of uncertainty. So each of these sites fall within one of these quadrants at least one time, which is, it's going to be difficult to say for sure, yeah, we should implement something here if we're not really certain if we can do it with certainty in the future.
Hey, Sean, can I ask
Yeah.
you a quick question? Just to clarify, the numbers correspond to the number of different environmental flow models, right? Like, so over 9 different models, this particular site was in this quadrant 9 times. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
It's across the climate scenarios. So each one of these, so there's 9 different climate scenarios, and these numbers are showing how many times this particular reservoir fell within one of these quadrants across those 9 climate scenarios.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Sorry, I probably explained that poorly.
No, it's okay. I'm like, can you go back to your, yeah, so I'm trying to understand and make sure that I understand what the micro C5, the CCSM4, those are flow regimes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So
So the flow regimes across different climate models, the combination.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, I should have said that.
No. I was just, I'm new to this, so I just want to make sure I understood. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So in each one of these sort of boxes here, we're quantifying how feasible it is to implement environmental flows and what's the biodiversity value in terms of conserving those fish species. Yeah. So I think I was on this slide. Yeah. So again, these sites out here in the western part of the basin, they fall within at least one of these quadrants once, or some of these low feasibility quadrants. Looking at this one out here, it's across all 9 of those future climate scenarios, it's consistently low value, low feasibility. And if we look at some of the patterns in the eastern portion of the basin, we see that these sites are actually pretty consistently within the low biodiversity value, high conservation feasibility quadrant. And I initially said that those, so if we imagine this scenario where we have a budget for the entire basin, and we see these sites, we might want to focus our attention maybe somewhere else. But these actually could be reservoirs where we say, why not? I mean, we have enough water, and allocating environmental flows could be beneficial to any of the species. So, so again, I think the main takeaway here is that there's significant spatial and temporal differences in conservation priorities across the river basin. And so the implications of this framework is that we could possibly use it as a core scale tool to identify, again, those high priority climate resilient sites in terms of implementing environmental flows in our case study. Again, if we're thinking about this from a planning perspective, we could possibly use it to winnow some of those candidate sites. So again, if we have, if we think about this, if we have a budget for the entire basin, we could eliminate a lot of those sites from consideration by just thinking about which ones are climate resilient and high priority. And so there's many other factors to consider. I understand I'm kind of boiling down conservation planning to 2 factors here. And many of you think about a plethora of other things when you're managing resources or considering conservation planning. But you can maybe use this tool in the early stages of planning to focus on maybe narrowing down those number of sites. So I think I'm out of time here, but I had another question. Can you think of a potential application for this framework that you could use for the resources you manage or study? But maybe I'll just open it up to questions, or if we want to move on to a break, I'll let Emma take over there.